So I'm going to give you a case study now of a real life sermon, real life preparation, from a busy pastor. This was what I did last week, okay? And this is the true story of everything that happened. So my text was Genesis 4. Now, I didn't know for sure what verses in Genesis 4 it was going to be. I just knew it was the Cain and Abel story, Genesis 4. And I knew that later I'd work out what verses to do, So I did my exegesis. This was Thursday morning at 9:30 to 11 a.m. I did 9:30 to 11 a.m. is an hour and a half. Okay, it's an hour and a half, which means all the timings are wrong in this. There's a typo there. So I spent an hour and a half in exegesis. This is what I did. I read it in Hebrew, and I compared it with different translations. Now, I'm not expecting that having done this course, you will read the Old Testament in Hebrew, okay? That's just a whole nother bit of training if you wanted to do that. But that's just what I did. I read it in Hebrew, and then I'm like, seeing how different translations have translated different. I'm like, oh, I want to translate it like that. And I'm like, how did the ESV translate it? How did the Net Bible translate it? How did the NIV translate it? And so on. And then there was a bunch of things I found, but there were some key observations that I've noted down here. One was there's a repeated word, nasar, which means to raise or to carry or to bear. And it's in Genesis 4:7, about Cain. And it's also in Genesis 4:13 when he says, my punishment is too much to carry, to bear. I was like, that's interesting. That's very interesting about him being downcast. And this word here, which is the same word then for this is too much for me to bear. I was like, that was fascinating to me. He's saying if Cain does what is right, his face will be raised. But when he doesn't, then he can't raise or carry the consequences. That was fascinating to me, okay? But that was some of the fat that got trimmed and didn't end up in the sermon. None of the translations I consulted brought out the idea of lifting in Genesis 4:7. That was just an interesting observation to me. Number two, there was a repeated word or concept, which is, there's two Hebrew words. One is eretz and one is Adamah, for ground or land. Genesis 4:2, verses 3, verses 10, verse 11, verse 12, verse 14, 16. Sometimes it used the word eretz, sometimes it used the word Adamah, for dry ground or for soil. And so it was interesting, this word just kept coming up in the chapter for ground, okay? Next observation. Oh, and again, that didn't end up in the sermon. Next observation, 3. Cain and Abel offer different types of sacrifices. One is from the land, the other is from animals. The animal offering is further described as firstborn. The land one is not described as first fruits. The sacrifice is possibly superior. And then I did a little biblical theme of animal sacrifices in the Garden of Eden, then Abel, Moses, and Jesus. Obviously, Jesus is not an animal sacrifice, but the animal sacrifices point to Jesus' sacrifice. Right, next one, 4, dialogue. God has two separate conversations with Cain. The first one warns him he's doing wrong, and he must master sin or sin will have him. The second conversation shows him his sin and curses him, and then shows him an extent of mercy. So there's a conversation there in the narrative. 5th one, God puts a mark on Cain to protect him. Biblical theme of God marking people to protect them. So I did some biblical theology here. You got Cain, there's a mark there to protect him. You got blood on the doors at the Passover, a mark to protect them. Rahab has her thread to protect her and her family. Ezekiel, in the book of Ezekiel, God puts a mark on the people who aren't going to be destroyed, his people. In Revelation, you get the mark of the Lamb, okay? But this doesn't fit systematic theology. Yeah, doing my biblical theology, I'm also doing my systematic theology because I know from 1 John 3:12 that Cain is the offspring of the devil. So this mark that's on Cain cannot be following this same trajectory in that way. It's not like the mark on the doorposts at Passover. Yeah, it's not like the mark of the Lamb because Cain is of the enemy, of the devil. He's offspring of the devil. Okay, so now you see how my systematic theology stops me making a mistake with my biblical theology. So remember way back we said, is one superior than the other? We're like, no, we need them both, right? So Cain is the offspring of the devil, Genesis 3:15 and Genesis 4:17 to 26. Oh yeah, sorry. I also know from the co-text that Cain is the offspring of the devil. So the co-text showed me Cain is the offspring of the devil. So the marking is not a salvific marking. That means it doesn't save you, but a common grace marking. It's to stop humans killing him, not God. Imagine if I hadn't spotted that, I could have made a horrendous mistake in my sermon. So that was quite big for me. By the way, I did just say that was big for me, not big of me. Okay. I'm saying like that was a big deal where I'm doing some biblical theology and then the systematic theology shows, Duncan, you're actually going down the wrong track here. So that's what I'm showing. This is real talk, what happens in a real preparation time. Now, observation 6. The verb for brother's keeper, the verb shamar, to protect, as in serve and protect, which was Adam's calling in the garden, Genesis 2:15, and is a priestly term from the Pentateuch. So when it says, am I my brother's keeper, it uses the Hebrew word shamar, which we've already seen earlier in Genesis, what Adam's supposed to do. He's supposed to protect the garden, he's supposed to keep the garden, right? And later, priests are told to serve and protect. And it's the same word, shamar, to guard, to keep. It's a priestly term. It's to do with worship. So Adam, now there is a biblical theology theme here of protecting garden. So I'm doing my biblical theology again. Adam failed to protect the garden and his wife, and now Cain has failed to protect his brother. Then I go to David. David was a shepherd, and he shepherded / protected Israel, but then failed to protect with Bathsheba, and also with the census, when he done the census. Jesus came and was the new Adam who protected his sheep. So you see, I've done some biblical theology there, right? Okay, observation 7. The co-text of Genesis 3 shows that Genesis 4 is the outworking of the hostility between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. Observation 8. Systematic theology shows Cain is the offspring of the devil, and that's why he kills his brother. Then I said, would have been good to have spent another 30 minutes in exegesis. So this is a Thursday morning. I'm teaching on the Sunday. I've got loads of urban ministry program jobs to do on my Thursday and on my Friday. So I'm like, right, I've just managed to take an hour and a half to do exegesis. I needed more time ideally, but I'm budgeting my time. This is what I'm going to go with. By God's grace, I'll have it done in time. So then I come on to what I think the main point of the text is. So this is now at 11:30 to 11:50 a.m. in the morning. So you can see this is there's half an hour's happening in between. This is probably me taking a tea break and possibly me doing another job. I'm a big fan of doing like 5-minute jobs, like being like, I've got 5 minutes now. What is a job can be done in 5 minutes? Boom, done, you know. So I would have been doing other jobs, but now I'm getting back into the text. I'm looking at the main point, right? So I've written down the whole things there. Genesis 4 verse 1. Eve has an offspring. Verse 2 to 4. Cain and Abel are contrasted in their sacrifices and attitudes. 4 to 5a. God looks on their sacrifices in different ways. 5b. Cain responds in great anger. Verses 6 to 7. God challenges Cain's anger and warns him to master sin. Verse 8. Cain responds by killing his brother. 9a. God gives Cain opportunity to confess, like he did with Adam. 9b. Cain lies to God and denies his responsibility to protect his brother. So it goes on like that. Yeah, I'm breaking it down. I'm trying to work out what's the main point. Then I write, the main point of this text is to further explain the hostility between the offspring of the devil and the offspring of the woman. It shows how the offspring of the devil ignore God's warnings and let sin master them. Now, one of the reasons why I got to that was because if you look at the end of these main point things, I know I didn't read them all out, but the last one was Genesis 4:25 to 26. Adam and Eve have Seth, the start of a godly line. And the one before that, verses 16 to 24, was Cain leaves God's presence and starts a city and continues a bad line of descendants. So the story ends with the two family trees. Remember we done that in biblical theology? You end up with these two family trees and it's showing us Cain's of the bad offspring. But thank God, through Seth now we're going to get this good offspring that then we know leads to Noah. So I'm like, this must be the main point of the author. It's explaining the hostility that was prophesied in Genesis 3:15. And it's showing how that works and showing how sin works in that and the devil works in that. Then I asked myself, is this accurate? And of course I said yes. Wow. Why would I say it's the main point if I didn't think it was accurate? Yeah. So I'm being a bit cocky here. Like, yeah, it's accurate. Then I'm like, is it adequate? And I'm like, yeah, no. It doesn't include sacrifice. I've just realized that my main point I gave did not include the sacrifice. Yet in the story of Cain and Abel, their sacrifices are contrasted. So I'm like, that ain't adequate, Duncan. Go back to the drawing board. So then I modified it. I got my modified main point. The main point of this text is to further explain the hostility between the offspring of the devil and the offspring of the woman. It shows how the offspring of the devil do not worship God properly and ignore God's warnings and let sin master them. Now I think I've got it adequate. So then I've done that for 20 minutes, getting my main point, and now I jump into doing some more biblical theology. I spend 6 minutes on this. This is 11:50 to 11:56. I'm aware it's getting close to lunch, and I'm like, let's get some more biblical theology in, because now I'm thinking it seems that I should now look into biblical theology in Genesis 4:7. Genesis 4:7 is the verse about sin crouching at your door. And this has really been interesting me as I've been looking at it. And this is the verse that I think I'm going to focus on. I'm thinking this is what I want to share with the people on Sunday. So I now need to do a biblical theology of Genesis 4:7. I hadn't done that before in my biblical theology. So I'm going back. I'm backtracking and doing some biblical theology. So then I think of the theme of sin crouching at the door and mastering it or being mastered by it. And I come up with a timeless truth. This is over the page. Timeless truth. Humans in this life have sin crouching at the door. That's my timeless truth. Abraham lying and failing to protect his wife. Miriam and Aaron bad-mouthing Moses instead of protecting him. David taking holiday instead of protecting his people in battle. Solomon and all the wicked kings who worship the Baals instead of protecting themselves and the people. The Pharisees and the Sadducees who love power and respect instead of protecting the people from legalism. Jesus then comes and ignores the temptations in the desert. He went to the cross saying, not my will, but yours be done. And in all this, protected his sheep from the devil who had been warring against us throughout history with sin crouching at our door. The devil wanted to get Peter and sift him like wheat. And Peter does give in temporarily, but Jesus prayed for him and died for him so that he would be restored. Praise the Lord. So that's my biblical theology there, right? And then I just spent 10 minutes praising God. I was just proper excited about this, okay? I was thanking Jesus for being a good shepherd. I ended up singing Psalm 23, and I thought this will be a good song to sing after the sermon. This will be the worship song. I always like to make this 2 songs after I worship. That's our tradition. I like them to fit the FCF. So I'm like, right, that's what we do. But later I trimmed off this juicy fat because I wanted to focus on sin crouching rather than the theme of protecting. So my exegesis, my biblical theology showed me that sin crouches at the door and many times stops people protecting, which is the role that humans have been given to shamar, the Hebrew verb is to protect. And it led me to think about how Jesus is the wonderful protector and how I was just praising him thinking, Jesus is amazing. But later when I come to do my FCF and all that, I'm like, we're not going to focus on the protecting. That was just for me. Like, that was just for, I was really blessed by that. You know, I still am. I'm like, wow, Jesus is my protector. Like, this is amazing. I'll teach that next year when I teach from Genesis 4 again, you know, and people think, here we go again, and then they get another angle. That was some of the fat that I trimmed. But at this stage, I didn't know that. I was just like, yes, I'm going to preach this, and then we're going to sing The Lord is my shepherd. And this is what I'm thinking at the moment. Then I had a ton of boring work to do, okay? I had lunch, did some boring work, and then at 4:20 in the afternoon, I got to get back to this, and I looked at the FCF. I spent 15 minutes on this. By the way, I tend to work quite quickly. I'm not saying these times are what you should go for. I tend to work quickly. This system here, I've been doing it for a while. It kind of becomes second nature. When you're doing it, it will take longer, and you'll find over time it gets quicker. Some of you are the kind of people that work real slow and get the job done. Some of you work real quick and get the job done. I don't think one way is better than the other. I think it's how God made you, and there's strengths and weaknesses to both of them. The same way that I love slow-cooked meat. Like, I love slow cooked meat. I mean, it's so tender. And I love the fact that the house has been smelling all day of whatever you've got in the slow cooker. And that is wonderful. But I also love cooking a steak real quick. And in fact, on Mother's Day, because both my mum and Kieran were like, we want ours well done, I didn't use the fat pan that I normally use, the fat frying pan. I use a thin frying pan because I knew it would get it nice and burnt on the sides. And that cooks well quick. And it's exciting cooking like that. You know, it's exciting. You're like, rah, it's cooked. You know, both are good. Slow cooking and fast cooking. Be what God made you to be. Yeah? Maybe you're the tortoise, maybe you're the hare. You know, both ways are good. Okay, so FCF. I'm going through the FCFs for Cain, yeah? And I'm like, sin is crouching at his door, wanting to master him. Another one, Cain feels that he has a right to be angry that God does not accept this unacceptable sacrifice. 3, Cain doesn't believe he has a responsibility to protect his brother. I put a question mark, so I'm like, is it that Cain don't believe he's his brother's keeper? Or is he just lying and coming up with some excuse? I don't know, so question mark. Next one, Cain doesn't offer an acceptable sacrifice. That's an FCF. Cain doesn't take God's advice. Cain is mastered by sin. Cain is unrepentant. Cain is only bothered by consequences of a sin, not by the hurt he's caused God and others. Now I go on to my FCF for the Old Testament Jewish readers. Sin wants to master us. We sometimes don't offer acceptable sacrifices. We sometimes get angry when we are the ones to blame. We often let sin master us. We don't always listen to God's advice. Sometimes we're more bothered by consequences than the offense we've caused. So these are very similar to Cain's ones, but now I'm making them for Old Testament Jews, and that's why now I'm saying we, as opposed to the ones for Cain are like Cain's this, Cain that. Now, FCS for Roehampton non-Christians on this estate. 1, sin wants to master them. It's them now because I'm not one of them. And they might not even be aware of that. 2, some people feel angry that God has not blessed them, even though they don't deserve his blessing. I think I could have done a good sermon on that. You know what I was about to say? I could have done a banging sermon on that. Yeah, yeah. I think that's because the other day I was saying how I find it weird that on Saturdays you get pastors tweeting saying, oh, I'm doing a banger tomorrow. And I'm just kind of like, that's a funny way to talk about your sermon prep. And then I find myself, hopefully I'm just almost said that because of that, but maybe it's just my own pride. Yeah, I would have smashed it. So 3, some people think and we'll talk about that later. I'll talk about the pride I had during this process as well. 3, some people think their role is to take care of number one and not take care of others. 4, some offer unacceptable sacrifices to God, e.g. giving money to Christian charities but not loving Jesus. 5, because we've had that in Roehampton, people who don't even come to church giving to New Life. You know, we've even had that with standing orders before. Like non-Christians giving standing orders. 5, people tend to mourn over consequences of sin more than the sin itself. 6, people tend to not repent, but instead complain about consequences. So all these are FCS for the manor. Then I do FCS for Roehampton Christians. And I'm building on what I've already been doing, but I'm considering what about for us believers. 1, we often forget that sin is actively wanting to master us, crouching at our door. 2, we tend to assume our sacrifices are acceptable to God when they might not be, and so on. You can read this at your leisure later. Then I say, the FCF I'm going to use this week is, we tend to ignore sin crouching at the door. That's my FCF. We tend to ignore sin crouching at the door. Is this compatible with the main point? Yes, but be mindful that Cain is the offspring of the devil and that they were giving offerings to God. So remember, my FCF talked about, it's explaining the hostility between the offspring of the woman and the offspring of the devil. And then I modified my FCF to say it's also talking about sacrifice and how the offspring of the devil don't worship God, right? So now I'm saying my FCF, I've got to take that into consideration. Okay, because I could, in this case, do a wrong one, and this is why it's good to check your main point as well. I could have done a wrong one, like I said earlier, about with the biblical theology. And I could do a wrong one here where I talk about Cain as if Cain is a Christian. Whereas I think the author would say, hey, part of the point of it is that Cain wasn't one of God's people. This is what happens with one of God's people. If you're living like Cain, That ain't right. That's not how it's supposed to be. You're not supposed to be living like Cain. So I could preach the message wrong, So now I've modified my FCF to, we tend to think we're doing right whilst ignoring sin crouching at our door. So now I'm like, okay, Cain thought he was doing the right thing with his sacrifice, but it weren't. Sin was crouching at his door. Okay, that's the FCF for that. We think, yeah, I'm worshipping God right, when we're not, and sin is crouching at our door. But check it out. Further modified during my second draft of the sermon. So what happened was later, I'm going through practicing doing my sermon and that, and I'm changing it up a bit. I can't remember if it was when I was practicing it or if I was just changing it up. And then I'm like, I'm going to change my FCF even more, okay? So I changed it to, we tend to think we're doing right whilst doing wrong and ignoring sin crouching at the door. So we tend to think we're doing right whilst doing wrong and ignoring sin crouching at the door. That ended up being my FCF. So that took me up to 4:30 roughly, yeah? I had some other work I had to do. Then I had dinner. And so then at 7:19 in the evening, I was like, okay, I've got a few minutes. I'm going to work on the application. I remember I was feeling a bit depressed, right? And I was like, I'm feeling depressed. What can I do? Well, I'm not going to give in to sin crouching at the door. I'm like, I'm going to do something constructive for God's glory. Application. That's what I'll do. I'll work on my application now, right? So you see how I'm applying the sermon already in my life. Sin's crouching at my door. Why don't you have a pity party, Duncan? Yeah, that's what you should do. And I'm like, no, not going to listen to sin. Do my application. So, spent about 20 minutes on this. I come up with my key elements here. First one, presenting a sacrifice to God, because that's what Cain and Abel were doing. 2, different ways of doing this. We get to see different ways of doing it. 3, one way is looked on with favor, the other is not. 4, the person who didn't give a good sacrifice becomes angry. 5, God warns him he shouldn't be angry. 6, God tells him he needs to do right and not wrong. 7, God warns him sin is trying to master him. This is why his sacrifice is bad and why he's angry. 8, Cain ignores the advice and kills his brother. And then in brackets I wrote, I might only go this far in this story. So remember, I don't know what my text is yet for sure. I'm thinking maybe I'll stop it here, just at this point. This is what I want to give the people. But I carry on doing my application work anyway. 9, God curses Cain. 10, Cain complains of his consequences. 11, God gives common grace and protects Cain. 12, Cain leaves God's presence. 13, Cain goes on to perpetuate the ungodly line of the devil. So those are my key elements. And now I come up with application for home, work, neighborhood, money, and mind and emotions, because I've just had sin crouching at my door in my emotions. So, home. Are you worshipping God the right way in the home? Are you aware that sin is crouching at the door of your home wanting to have you? Does it mess up your worship? Are you mastering sin in your attitude to your spouse, your kids, your housemates, your general home life? Now there, can you see, I haven't put in every single element. One of the reasons is because all the elements together are pointing to someone who's in the unbelieving community. And I'm hoping to preach to a lot of people who are in the believing community, and a minority in the room who are going to be in the unbelieving community, who I want them to join the believing community. So I'm giving the, are you worshipping God the right way in the home? Which one of those key elements have I got there? If you turn back the page to application, key elements. So my application is, are you worshipping God the right way in the home? Turn to the person next to you and see if you can come up with the answer. It might be more than one. It might be more than one key element. So yeah, for that part of the application, it says, are you worshipping God the right way in the home? Which key elements did you come up with? All right, someone help her out. I heard you say it. You were the only person I heard get it right.
We chose the first three.
The first three, excellent. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, presenting a sacrifice to God. Different ways of doing this. One is looked on with favour, the other not. So I put that in my application there. Yeah. Then I did my work application, which is what kind of sacrifices do you make at work? Are they pleasing to God, or are they merely the sacrifices your boss asks you to do? So which key elements is that? It's the same ones again. It's 1 to 3. It's the same one. It's basically, there's 2 ways of doing a sacrifice, the right way and the wrong way. Your sacrificial life at work, is it done the right way or the wrong way? And then I've put, are you aware of sin crouching at your door at work? So what key element there? Turn to the person next to you and identify the key element that I've used there for that application. So for that one, what did you come up with? Which element?
7.
7, yeah, 7. So, that's exactly it. God warns him sin is trying to master him. So here I'm saying, are you aware of sin crouching at your door at work? Okay, then I do one for the neighborhood. Yeah. I do one for money. And I do one for the mind and emotions. So I've done my application, yeah, and that's really helped me think a bit further about this whole thing, right? So, but then the rest of the evening, I'm not doing any work on this. The next day, Friday, right? Next day, Friday. As far as I'm concerned, I've done all my preparation. Now all I've got left to do is write the sermon. So now I'm thinking, how do I communicate this wonderful stuff I've learned to God's people and to non-Christians who need to hear it? So Friday at 12 o'clock, I spend 10 minutes writing my intro. Okay? For my intro, what are the components I do? F, E, B. Exactly. E, F, 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 E, B. It's as simple as, yeah. So that's what I do. Yeah, I spend 10 minutes on that. Then I go to my help. Yeah, now here's the thing with the intro, yeah. Intros can be hard, right? I'm happy to spend 10 minutes on it. I know that later I can come back and change it. But it just so happens I have a real life story of someone crouching behind me and me getting tripped up. So I'm like, I think I got my story. I think I know why God let that happen to me. It's so I could preach this. So, boom. Right, help. I spend an hour and a half doing my help. I know, all I've got to do is come up with an E, an L, a P and a P, yeah? Sometimes I won't do a practice, I'll just do a picture, yeah? Sometimes I'll have the picture linked with the explain, sometimes I have the picture linked with the FCF, sometimes I have the picture, yeah, I suppose, yeah, so I can move it around, but it's not intimidating to me because I just know I've just got to do an E, an L, a P and a P, okay? So I find that really makes it easier for me. I don't feel like I've got a blank canvas and it's like paint. And I'm like, oh, I'm like, okay, I do it stage by stage, work through it. And I know that if I get interrupted, it's okay. Because I know where I've stopped and I can come back to it and be like, what do I need to do next? Another P. And then go on like that. So then that took me up to 2:40 and then I went straight into my conclusion. So I did all my help in one go. And then I went on to writing the conclusion. I spent 15 minutes on this, doing my conclusion. That's not a lot of time to write your conclusion, but see what happens later, okay? This is real life stuff. Then I pray, and you can see I'm an incredibly godly man, because I spent a whole 4 minutes praying, yeah? So again, like this is just true stories. I was keeping a record of everything I did, and I was thinking, this is embarrassing now, to tell people that I prayed for only 4 minutes about this, yeah? Okay, but this is just a real life thing, case study. Now, here's the thing though. Hopefully, in your devotional time throughout the week, you've been praying along this line anyway. Of course, if you only started preparing a sermon on Thursday, that's only Thursday morning, Friday morning, Saturday morning, and Sunday morning to pray about it. So the earlier you get a start on it, the more you can be praying it in your devotions. Okay, Then I spent 41 minutes. This was later in the day, yeah. This is 4:30, so this is like an hour and a half later. I go over it for 40 minutes, refining it. I reworded something. Some things I'm like, the way I worded that is rubbish. I discarded some stuff. Some stuff, what I do in my mind maps, if I think I'm going to discard something, I move it to the other side, because you see my mind maps, they're a bit quirky. Everything's down one side instead of going round in a circle. And what I do is when I discard stuff, I put it over on the other side. And that means in a year's time, if I come back to that text, I might look at my discarded stuff and be like, oh, I want to use that. Because I'm like, I spent time writing that. I don't want to just delete it. That's kind of depressing. So, and then I altered my FCF slightly. So at this stage, I'm like, I want to change my FCF a bit. So I changed my FCF a bit. And then I changed the touchdown. So remember, on my conclusion, how much time did I say I spent on it?
10 minutes.
Was it 10 minutes? Wow, I thought it was 15, but okay. 15 minutes. 15 minutes. So that wasn't a lot of time. So I changed my touchdown. I didn't feel that the conclusion I wrote was a good enough touchdown. So I changed it. Remember we said the plane's got to properly land. So I changed that touchdown there. Right, that's Friday, yeah? That was a busy day, Friday. So then Saturday's my family day, right? Where I'm with the family. I don't work on Saturday. But I haven't got the sermon ready yet. I've exegeted it and everything. A few years ago, I would have been like, I'm good to go now. But I know now I've got to spend time working out how to communicate it. So what do? Whilst the kids are at football training, right? 11:45 to 12:15, I spent 30 minutes practicing this, yeah? I went in my living room. I got my iPad with my mind map on it, taking a step, taking another step, and I'm doing this, yeah, for 30 minutes. I loudly half read out my notes. I say half read out. I was looking at my mind map and kind of sort of reading a bit of it, freestyling the rest, and kind of going back and forth like that. I added in phrases that came to me as I freestyled. I found myself just sort of preaching to an invisible crowd, and then I'd say something, and I'd be like, oh, I should put that in. Then I quickly put it in my mind map, yeah? Then what's next? I changed the touchdown even more. I gave it a firmer landing. I was like, I'm not happy with this touchdown. I've got to give it a firmer landing, so I tweaked that more. That's 30 minutes, yeah? Then I think I had lunch with the family. And then I was like, do you know what? I should check with a commentary. Like, I've done my own exegesis, but I don't know what other Christians are saying about this. I'm like, I really should check a commentary because I might have totally misunderstood the text. I spent 45 minutes reading a commentary. The commentary I picked was my favorite one for Genesis. I read that one. It took me 45 minutes to read. I was kind of gutted that I spent a whole 45 minutes on a commentary. But anyway, the commentator pointed out that Hebrews 11:4, well, he pointed out Hebrews 11:4 that says, by faith, Abel offered a better sacrifice. I knew this. I've even put it in the catechism, and I forgot it. So using a commentary reminded me of something that I had forgotten. I felt like a proper muppet. I was like, oh, I can't believe it. Good job I looked at a commentary. Then I disagreed with the commentator who said that Cain did not have a duty to keep or guard his brother. I disagreed with that. I'm like, bruv, I disagree. He's the older brother. And it was the calling of Adam in the garden to shamar, to keep, to protect. So I'm sorry, I disagree. You're cleverer than me, but I disagree. I've given my reasons. I don't just want to be like, I disagree. I gave my reasons here. As God's image bearers, we have a duty to serve and protect. This is a biblical theology theme throughout Scripture. And then I did a couple of tweaks to the sermon. You know, the commentator that got me thinking again about the sermon and all that. And then I thought, let me tweak this here, let me tweak that there. Okay. Then I enjoy a day off. Okay. Then 11:10, this is at night time, 11:10, yeah? I read over my notes and I'm praying about them. I only spend 15 minutes doing this, yeah? I've got to have time of rest, yeah? So I'm like, spend 15 minutes doing this. And as I do that, I'm like, I'm going to give it a sermon title. Something's crouching at your door. Genesis 4. That's going to be my sermon title. I text the guy on the desk, say that's the sermon title, so that he knows for his recording. And I'm like, cool, I've got the sermon title now. I think it's reasonably catchy and that's it. I don't think the sermon title is essential. Sometimes you need to ask other people after the sermon, what should that be called? Some people are really good at sermon titles, some people aren't. But that's a minor. Main thing is I spent some time reading over the notes and praying. Then Sunday morning, this was the day that the clocks went forward. Oh, it's Mother's Day, so it's painful. It's Mother's Day. You've got to prepare a sermon, and then you've got to prepare a meal for your mother and the mother of your children, and you've lost an hour's sleep and all that. So this for me was a bit of a challenge on Sunday morning. So I read over the notes and I was praying between 9:45 and 10:45. I spent an hour reading over the notes and praying. I would have liked more time on this. I went into the sermon on Sunday morning feeling like I didn't really know which L's and what P's went with what verses. Okay? I did not spend enough time pacing around my living room, looking at, practicing all my ELPs. And I was like, I know there's a bunch of L's and P's. I can remember the L's and P's. I don't know what verses they go with, right? What I do just before I preach is I look at my mind map and I look at all the orange circles, because all the orange circles for me are pictures. And for me, if I can remember the picture, it really helps me. And I'm like, I've got to remember these pictures. I don't want to miss out one of these pictures. So I quickly look at the pictures and I'm like, okay, well, at least I can remember the pictures, right? Okay. My total prep time, I wrote, was 6 hours, 51 minutes, but earlier we noticed I missed out an hour. So far I've spent 7 hours, 50. So it's about 8 hours prep for this sermon. And I'm feeling like I wish I'd spent more time preparing. I don't feel ready, okay? And we had technical problems before the service. So I'm trying to fix, the sound just before, so that happens. God brings that into our life. It's all part of the deal. So then 11:30 to 12:45, for 45 minutes I preached it, okay? During the sermon, I left out L's and P's because I forgot them. So I'm preaching, I'm not properly prepared, I miss out some L's and I miss out some P's, but I managed to fit them in the next ELP. So I move on to my next verse, I'm teaching, and suddenly I remember, I'm supposed to do that. So I just bring it in. I just bring in one of the L's and one of the P's. I don't think people were sitting there going like, wait a minute. And because I don't preach anymore saying, now my first point is and my second point is, because I don't actually believe that's how we communicate and get our minds changed about things, it still worked. The L's and the P's getting a bit mixed up, it still worked, okay? So, in my crescendo to Christ, I forgot to mention that Christ ruled over sin in the wilderness. This is a big part of my biblical theology. This is one of the things I was praising God about in my room, And then when I do my crescendo to Christ, I say, he ruled over sin, Well, I don't say anything about when he's in the desert and the devil's tempting him. That's like a key part of it. I just miss it out because I wasn't properly prepared, you see. Right? And so what I did, I snuck it into the prayer at the end. So remember I told you, don't do this, So this is what I did. I'm praying at the end of the sermon, and as I'm praying, I'm like, oh my days, the wilderness. So then I'm like, thank you, Jesus. You ruled over sin in the wilderness when you were tempted, I'm like, I got to get it in there, man. I got to let people know that Jesus done that, so sneak it in the prayer. So like I said, prepare so that you don't have to sneak it in the prayer. But when you don't prepare properly, sneak it in the prayer. Okay, so this all showed I needed to spend more time practicing the sermon. Then during the worship, so we're worshiping God immediately after the sermon, I quickly had this thought of, that was a really good sermon, okay? Had this proud thought, Duncan, that was a really good sermon. You've done a good job, right? And then I remembered it was only because the Bible text was good. If the sermon was good, it's because the Bible text was really good. That's why. And that it's all about Jesus and not me. And then I had just a good time of crying out to God in the worship, just praising Jesus. So you can see there, sin was crouching at my door immediately after the sermon, trying to get me to big myself up, take credit for a sermon that I didn't prepare properly for, that I forgot stuff, got stuff mixed up, and that the really good stuff about it was the stuff that God had put in there, and by his grace allowed me to find some of that stuff and communicate it with the gifts he gave me. And then there's me thinking, yeah, I've done it. So spiritual warfare immediately after the sermon. So after the sermon, a few people said it was a very good sermon. So I asked them, I said, oh, what bit spoke out to you the most? Remember I said that? People like big you up about the sermon, ask them, so what spoke to you the most? Don't be like, oh yeah, I know it was, wasn't it? Yeah, I smashed it. One person said it impacted them in a really big way. They said they'd been expecting the usual look to Jesus sermon. They said, I was expecting you to be like, yeah, look to Jesus. And they said, but then you had this thing about sin crouching at your door, and it really got me. And I was like, heavy. That's why I firmly believe don't only point to Christ, but also teach the text, and the examples that are there in the text for us, teach that as well, and point to Christ. Have both and. As a result, they shared a couple of things that they wanted to change in their life. So that was very encouraging. That's it. So that is a real life thing of what happens, yeah? Warts and all. So some stuff went well, some stuff didn't go so well. But that's it. Now you're going to be sent the link to the sermon and to my mind map for it. If you want to, you can watch it and follow along in the mind map. And so now you've got an example of my preparation for it. You can get an idea of the whole thing if you want to. So it's there for you. Does anyone have any questions?
I've got a comment.
A comment and a question.
That was really helpful.
Okay.
Just walking through that whole process. It really solidified a lot of the stuff that we've been going through.
Cool. Praise God.
I second that, and it's just a personal question, but it could be broad. Have you ever changed the FCF 2 minutes before the sermon?
Changed the FCF 2 minutes before the sermon?
I think the main point of it is there, the FCF, but you've had to reword it in a way which you think will hit people harder, or even just before the introduction. I was just asking.
I don't think I've ever changed the FCF 2 minutes before the sermon. I've made plenty of mistakes when I've been preaching, and I think more times the mistakes I do come down to not proper preparation.
I'm still trying to get my head around the ELP stuff. How many of them do you have in this sermon, for example?
I don't know how many ELPs I had in the sermon, but what I'd say is look at the mind map, and then you'll see how many ELPs I had, and you'll see I do my verses and then the ELP, so you'll be able to see how many ELPs I did for how many verses at a time and that. But it's one of those questions a bit like, how long is a piece of string? So it's like when people say to me, how long do you preach for? The answer is, as long as it takes to teach that truth. So if I'm doing my FCF and my ELP and everything, and it's like, that ends up being a 25-minute sermon, I'm preaching a 25-minute sermon. If to teach that so it cuts to the heart, it takes 45 minutes, then it takes 45 minutes. And that will really vary depending on the verses and how much prior learning people have got in who you're talking to. Any questions from anyone who hasn't asked a question yet about this process?
So you see for the elves,
This guy, the whole time listen, people were tired on Sunday because the clocks had changed. A lot of people kind of sitting like this, like battling the tiredness. The whole time he's there like this. And I was thinking, what's going on? Well, and then I realized afterwards it was like, because he's been taught the whole process of this, and he's like, oh yeah, help, yeah. Link to FCF, touchdown, like crescendo to Christ. So it was really encouraging seeing your face the whole time, so thanks for that, bro.
And he's doing antics in his Simon joke.
for example, like explain. Can you explain like the whole text, or can you go verse by verse, then you link to FCF, then you do your PP for that verse, and then you do the next verse, or can you do like the whole thing as? Do you see what?
Are you asking, are you able to just read out the whole Bible story and then just do one elp for the whole Bible story and like explain the whole thing?
Yeah.
I think you could do that. If I was doing like a children's talk, I might do that. I might give them the story of Cain and Abel, and then I might do my explain, my link to FCF, my picture and my practice, and then say, let's pray. I might do it that way. But in general, I'm breaking it down into bite-sized chunks every time I think there's a significant link to the FCF there. If you like, you could call it an insight. Every time there's a significant insight, I'm like, oh, that helps with this. I'm going to pause at that verse, and then I'm going to do an help. So sometimes my explain is for one phrase, sometimes my explain is for one verse, and sometimes my explain is for 3 verses. I read out 3 verses, one go. And you'll see in the Genesis 4, in the end, I decided to do the whole chapter. And in the end, I read out the offspring of Cain. So that's a bunch of verses, one go, boom. And my help is something like, this is the ungodly line. My picture is, this is the first ever gangster rap. My, and so on. So I've done a chunk of verses together there, boom, like that. But remember, what I'm giving you aren't rules, but are tools.
And you remember when we were taught to look at the text and not follow the kind of verses and the headings that the Bible gives you, but look at it yourself and think, where does it start and finish? Could you do an L where, for me, I've got a verse where I feel that the previous verse should have ended, and could I split the verse in half and give an L that way? Or, you understand what I mean?
You could do. Like, I can't tell you if that what you did was correct. Like, I don't know what it was and all that. But in theory, you could say, look, this verse, someone's given it a verse division here, but I really think it should be split in half, and that's what I'm doing. You could do that, yeah.
Explain that's what you've done.
You could explain it depending on the congregation. You might want to say to them, now listen, the way the verses weren't originally in the Bible, someone added them later. So in this case, I think this section ends here, and so on. You would know your people best if you need to explain it.
Yeah.
You know.
So if you had longer during the week to say if you started preparing the sermon on the Monday or the Tuesday, would you be thinking through, so these time limits, they're good, I like them, I like seeing that, but would you be thinking through more, even in your spare time, like how to prepare the sermon?
Yeah.
Just thinking about in your head and new ideas and stuff.
Yeah, and basically, Genesis 4, I'd already thought the week before, I'll do Genesis 4, and I'd already been thinking about it and that, so yeah, as much as possible, really, as much as possible. In an ideal world, I would prepare the sermon, I would start preparing it 2 weeks before I'm teaching it. My lifestyle, I always end up preparing it on the Thursday. Once UMP's over, that might change, but if I prepared the sermon on a Monday or Tuesday, then our Wednesday sessions together would suffer. And I'd be trying to think about what we're supposed to be doing, and my head's in the sermon. So. There's a disadvantage to preparing too early in advance. I've discovered that before. Then when you go to teach it, you can't remember it. So you also want it to be reasonably fresh. Well done, everyone. You've done the teaching the Bible in an urban context. There's been a lot of stuff there. Biblical theology, exegesis, how to teach the Bible. I'm hoping that now you're starting to see systematic theology. I'm hoping that you're now starting to see how all this stuff comes together and equips you now so that you can really minister to people using God's word, using the tools God's given you. He's given you his word. He's given you his Holy Spirit. You can go and swing that sword now for God's glory.